I raised my daughter with my blood, sweat, and tears. At her wedding, her new father-in-law threw a glass of ice water directly into my face in front of 900 elite guests. The entire ballroom went dead silent. I stood there dripping wet, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Do you really know who you just insulted?" His smug, arrogant smile vanished. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and this is the story of how my only daughter's perfect fairy tale wedding exposed a dark, calculating nightmare I never saw coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who drastically underestimated your worth." The ice-cold water hit me before I even saw the crystal glass move. 1 second I was trying to navigate my way across the crowded, dimly lit dance floor to get a better view of my daughter, and the very next second, a freezing shock knocked the breath right out of my lungs. My vision blurred as the freezing liquid dripped heavily from my eyelashes, soaking instantly into the stiff collar of my rented tuxedo. The lively, upbeat jazz band that had been playing a classic tune abruptly stopped. The final high-pitched note of the saxophone hung awkwardly and painfully in the air, creating a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. 900 of Boston's absolute elite guests turned their heads to look. The massive, opulent hall fell into a dead, suffocating silence. You could have heard a single pin drop on the polished marble floor. Standing less than 2 feet away from me was Victor Kensington, my daughter Sarah's new father-in-law. He was holding the now empty crystal glass in his right hand. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Watch where you are going, you uncultured mechanic." Victor spat out, his voice booming and echoing clearly across the completely silent ballroom. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "You just stepped on my wife's custom designer gown with your filthy boots. You clearly do not belong here, and you never did." The whispers started immediately. It was like the hissing of 100 snakes. I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares of the politicians, the hedge fund managers, and the old money socialites burning into my skin. They looked at me exactly the way Victor did, like I was a stray dog that had somehow wandered into a royal palace. I did not scream. I did not raise my hands in defense. I did not retaliate in a blind fit of anger. I just stood there, an old man who looked entirely out of place, and I stared right back at Victor Kensington. My hands were permanently calloused from decades of hard labor. My shoulders were slightly hunched from years of carrying the weight of the world. But my mind was sharper than anyone in that ballroom could possibly comprehend. I reached into my pocket, slowly pulled out a simple cotton handkerchief, and quietly wiped the freezing water from my eyes and my cheeks. While I stood there taking his public verbal abuse, a bitter, intensely ironic thought crossed my mind. If Victor only knew the actual truth, his fragile, arrogant reality would shatter into a million jagged pieces. In that painfully silent moment, I thought about the $500,000 I had anonymously wired to the elite wedding planners just 3 months ago to pay for this exact event. Every single imported white orchid decorating this room, every drop of vintage champagne bubbling in their expensive crystal glasses, the imported caviar, the renowned jazz band, the rental of this historic Boston estate, I paid for all of it. Every single dime. Why did I do it anonymously? Because my 28-year-old daughter Sarah had begged me to. "Dad, please," she had pleaded with me months ago, tears welling up in her beautiful eyes. Preston's family is very particular. They are Boston high society. They have a reputation to maintain among their peers. If I let them handle the event planning and the finances, they will finally accept me as one of their own. Please, Dad, just let them take the credit. I want this fairy tale to be perfect. I raised Sarah completely alone after her mother passed away, when she was just a little girl. She was my entire world. I never could say no to her. So I became the invisible benefactor. I let the arrogant Kensingtons pretend they were graciously funding the wedding of the decade. I gave them a blank check, and I happily took a back seat. I sat quietly at a small table in the far corner of the room, dressed like a poor, retired blue-collar worker, trying not to take up too much space. They thought I was just a grease monkey, a charity case given a pity seat out of social obligation. They had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and sole anonymous owner of Cole Logistics, a global shipping empire I built from absolute scratch with nothing but my own 2 hands. They had no idea my actual net worth was over $2 billion. I was the wealthiest man in that room by a massive, undeniable margin. Yet here I was, standing soaked and publicly humiliated, taking the brunt of Victor Kensington's manufactured aristocratic rage. I waited for the groom to intervene. I waited for Preston, my smooth-talking new son-in-law, to step between us, to calm his raging father down, to defend the man who had raised the woman he supposedly loved. Preston hurried over, pushing his way through the crowd of stunned, whispering guests. But he did not look angry at his father. He looked furious with me. Instead of de-escalating the situation or asking if I was all right, Preston grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep as he aggressively shoved me toward the heavy exit doors. "You are embarrassing, Sarah." Preston hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You are ruining our perfect night. You need to leave. Leave right now." I pulled my arm out of his violent grip and turned my head to look for Sarah. I needed to see my daughter. I needed her to step forward to say something to stop this absolute madness. I spotted her standing near the massive 5-tier wedding cake. She was wearing the white silk dress I had quietly paid for. Her face was deathly pale, her hands visibly trembling as she clutched her bridal bouquet. Our eyes met across the silent, staring crowd. For one agonizing second, I waited for her to run to me, to push Preston away, to tell them they were wrong. Instead, she started weeping, covered her mouth with her hands, and looked away. She just looked away. My own daughter, the child I had sacrificed my entire life to protect, chose to stand in silence while I was thrown out like common garbage. The message was brutally clear. I was a stain on her perfect new elite life. I did not say another word. I turned my back on the cruel murmurs, the fake pity, and the smug smirks of the Kensington family. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and walked out into the freezing Boston night. The cold, heavy rain began to fall immediately, soaking through my cheap, rented jacket, mixing with the water still dripping from my face. As I stood alone on the wet pavement, waiting for my battered old pickup truck to be brought around by the confused valet, a terrifying, undeniable realization began to settle deep in my gut. This public humiliation was not an accident. It was a calculated test. And the true nightmare was only just beginning. The freezing rain soaked through my thin cotton shirt, sticking it uncomfortably to my skin. I stood under the grand awning of the estate, shivering slightly, waiting for the valet to bring around my 1998 Ford F-150. The valet, a young kid in a sharp red vest, had given me a look of pure confusion when I handed him the keys earlier that evening. It was the only battered vehicle parked among a sea of imported luxury cars, a stark reminder of the disguise I had chosen to wear. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. I could still feel the phantom sensation of Victor Kensington's ice water dripping down my neck. I kept my eyes fixed on the wet asphalt, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My daughter had looked away. That was the wound that bled the most. The public humiliation meant nothing to me. I had survived cutthroat boardroom battles and ruthless corporate takeovers that would make Victor weep like a child. But Sarah turning her back on me, that was a blade straight to the heart. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors behind me pushed open. The warm golden light from the ballroom spilled out onto the wet pavement, accompanied by the muffled sound of the jazz band starting up again. They were already moving on. Preston hurried out into the cold, pulling his tailored tuxedo jacket tight against the rain. He spotted me and immediately jogged over, his face twisted into a mask of deep, frantic concern. It was a perfect performance. If I did not know any better, I would have thought he actually cared. "Richard," he breathed out, panting slightly, as if he had run a marathon to find me. He placed a warm, manicured hand on my damp shoulder. I did not shrug it off, but I did not lean into it either. I just looked at him, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and uncomfortable. "I am so incredibly sorry about what just happened in there," Preston said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "You have to understand, my father is not in his right mind tonight. He recently started a new prescription for a serious heart condition. The doctors explicitly told him not to mix it with alcohol, but he has been drinking vintage scotch all evening to celebrate. It caused a severe manic episode. He does not even know what he is saying or doing right now." I stared into Preston's perfectly clear, calculating brown eyes. It was a flawless, plausible lie. A manic episode caused by medication and alcohol. It was the perfect excuse to quickly sweep a horrific public insult right under the rug. It painted Victor as a victim of his own health rather than a cruel, arrogant bully. "Please, Dad." Preston continued using the familial title with a smooth, practiced ease that made my stomach churn. "I know you are hurt, and you have every right to be angry. But please try to understand the pressure I am under right now. This is my wedding night. Sarah is inside having a complete panic attack in the bridal suite. I am trying to hold my entire family together. I just need you to be the bigger person tonight. Please go back to your hotel, get some warm clothes, and rest. I personally promise you that I will bring my father to your room first thing tomorrow morning, and he will give you the deepest, most sincere apology of his life." He squeezed my shoulder one last time, playing the role of the exhausted, stressed groom protecting his fragile bride. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. He was asking me to swallow my pride for the sake of my daughter's happiness. He knew I would do anything for Sarah. "I will go to my hotel," I said quietly, my voice betraying absolutely no emotion. Preston let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. "Thank you, Richard. Thank you for understanding. I promise I will make this right tomorrow." He turned and rushed back into the warmth of the ballroom, leaving me alone in the dark once again. The valet finally pulled my old truck up to the curb. I climbed inside, the worn leather seat creaking familiarly under my weight. I turned the key, listening to the engine roar to life, and drove away from the glowing estate. The drive back to downtown Boston was a blur of neon lights and sweeping windshield wipers. The heater in the truck blasted warm air, but the chill had settled deep into my bones. I kept replaying Preston's words in my head. His story was convenient. It was almost too perfect. But a father's love is a dangerous blinder, and I desperately wanted to believe that Sarah had not married a monster. I wanted to believe it was just a terrible misunderstanding. I drove to the Four Seasons, the luxury hotel where I had booked a grand suite for the weekend. I had used a generic travel agency to keep my wealth hidden, ensuring the reservation looked like a modest gift from a distant relative. I tossed my keys to the hotel valet, walked through the pristine glass doors, and crossed the sprawling marble lobby. My wet boots squeaked embarrassingly against the polished floor, drawing judgmental looks from the late-night patrons. I did not care. I just wanted a hot shower and a quiet place to think. I approached the mahogany front desk and handed the clerk my driver's license. "Good evening," I said, my voice rough from the cold. "I need a key to my room. The reservation is under Richard Caldwell." The young clerk, dressed in a sharp suit, tapped quickly on his keyboard. He frowned, adjusted his glasses, and typed again. His polite customer service smile slowly faded into a look of genuine awkwardness. "I am very sorry, Mr. Caldwell," the clerk said hesitantly, avoiding my eyes. "But it appears your reservation was cancelled earlier this evening." I stared at him, the buzzing noise of the lobby suddenly fading away. "Cancelled? That is impossible. I paid for the suite a month ago. I checked in yesterday. My luggage is currently sitting upstairs in the room." The clerk typed furiously, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Sir, the notes in our system indicate that the cancellation was requested exactly 2 hours ago. It was authorized by the designated event coordinator for the Kensington wedding party. A Mr. Preston Kensington called us directly. He stated there was a sudden family emergency and that you would no longer require the accommodations." A cold, heavy knot formed tightly in the pit of my stomach. Preston. He canceled my room. "What about my belongings?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet octave. The clerk swallowed hard. "Mr. Kensington arranged for a private courier service to pack your belongings and transfer them. He provided us with a new address. Your bags were sent to a motel near the interstate highway about 20 miles outside the city limits. He said he had already discussed this relocation with you." I stood completely frozen at the mahogany desk. The plausible lie that Preston sold me in the rain was broken. This was no random drunken accident. It was a cold, calculated eviction to isolate me. I felt a sudden clarity wash over me as the truth settled deep in my weary bones. My daughter was in terrible, immediate danger. The cheap motel near the interstate was everything the front desk clerk had promised. It was a bleak, rundown box with peeling floral wallpaper and a distinct lingering odor of stale cigarette smoke mixed with cheap bleach. Rain hammered relentlessly against the single grime-stained window, casting distorted, moving shadows across the threadbare carpet. My luggage, a pair of worn canvas duffel bags, sat unceremoniously piled at the foot of a lumpy mattress. I did not bother unpacking. I did not even take off my damp tuxedo jacket. I just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the flickering red neon sign flashing outside the window. The loud noise of the heavy transport trucks driving on the wet asphalt outside provided a steady, monotonous rhythm to my racing thoughts. I desperately needed absolute silence tonight, but I forced my tired mind to focus. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it all began to sink in, pushing past the initial shock and settling into a cold, hard knot in my chest. Victor Kensington had not just lost his temper. A man like Victor, obsessed with his fragile social standing, does not cause a massive, humiliating public scene at his own son's wedding unless there is a very specific, carefully designed reason for it. Preston canceling my hotel room was not an act of a stressed groom trying to keep the peace. It was a surgical strike. They wanted me out of the picture. They wanted me entirely isolated, pushed to the margins where I could not interfere. But why? My mind, trained by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, began to turn the problem over and over. I closed my eyes and let my intuition guide me. I began to meticulously analyze Preston's behavior over the last 6 months. When he first started dating Sarah, he played the role of the perfect, attentive gentleman. He brought me expensive bottles of whiskey I pretended to be impressed by, and he always made a show of asking for my fatherly advice. But looking back, I could see the subtle, insidious shifts. Once they got engaged, Preston slowly began building invisible walls around my daughter. He convinced Sarah to quit her demanding but fulfilling job as an architect, insisting that his income was more than enough, and that she should focus on planning their life together. Then came the sudden relocation. He pushed her to move out of the vibrant city apartment I had helped her furnish, isolating her in a sprawling, heavily gated Kensington family estate in the suburbs. She was surrounded by his people, his influence, his narrative. Her calls to me became less frequent, always rushed, always echoing Preston's opinions. "Dad, Preston thinks we should invest in this. Dad, Preston says this neighborhood is not safe for me anymore." He was slowly, methodically replacing her independent voice with his own. He was severing her lifelines one by one, making himself her only source of truth and security. I had chalked it up to the overwhelming stress of wedding planning and the natural transition of a new marriage. I had been a fool. The signs were blaring like sirens. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered the exact moment I had felt this profound, icy dread before. It was just 1 week ago. I was visiting Sarah at the Kensington estate, sharing a quiet cup of coffee with her on the patio, while Preston was supposedly running errands. We were laughing about an old childhood memory when Preston suddenly marched outside, interrupting us with a tight, artificial smile. He was carrying a thick, unmarked manila folder. He leaned down, kissed Sarah gently on the cheek, and placed the folder on the glass table between us. "Darling," he had said smoothly, his voice dripping with faux affection, "my accountant needs these signed by noon today." It is just some routine tax disclosures for your change in marital status. Standard paperwork for the joint accounts. Do not worry your pretty head about the details, just sign on the dotted lines. Sarah, completely trusting and eager to please her new husband, had reached for her pen without a single moment of hesitation. She flipped open the folder and began rapidly signing page after page, not reading a single word of the dense legal jargon. I was sitting right there across from them. I had casually glanced down at the documents as she flipped the pages. At the time, I did not want to be the overbearing, paranoid father. I did not want to insult Preston by demanding to read his private financial documents. But my eyes had caught a fleeting glimpse of the heavy embossed logo at the top of the crisp white pages. It was the crest of a highly exclusive private wealth management bank in Boston. It was not just any bank. It was the exact institution that held Sarah's $10 million trust fund. I had set up that specific trust fund for her 20 years ago, carefully securing her financial future in a way that she could easily access once she married or turned 30. Sarah knew about the $10 million. She believed it was the entirety of my life savings, a massive windfall from a lucky early investment. She thought I lived modestly because I had given her everything I had. She had absolutely no idea that her father was worth over $2 billion and that the trust fund was barely a fraction of my actual wealth. Preston knew about the trust. Sarah had proudly told him about it, believing it would help them start their life together. But Preston did not know about the $2 billion. He thought the $10 million was the ceiling. And men like Preston, men with expensive tastes and failing family fortunes, do not view $10 million as a foundation. They view it as a target. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. The documents Sarah signed a week ago were not standard tax forms. They were legal authorizations. Preston was moving her assets. But to execute a massive sudden transfer of a $10 million trust without raising immediate red flags, he needed Sarah completely isolated. He needed to ensure I was not around, to ask questions, to demand an audit, or to step in and freeze the accounts. He needed me disgraced, discredited, and physically removed from the inner circle. The humiliating scene with Victor, the water thrown in my face, the canceled hotel room. It was all a highly orchestrated, desperate distraction. They were keeping everyone focused on the social scandal while they quietly robbed my daughter blind. I stood up from the lumpy mattress. The coldness in my bones was instantly replaced by a burning, laser-focused rage. I walked over to the dirty window and looked out at the pouring rain. They really thought I was just a tired old mechanic who would quietly disappear into the night and lick his wounds. They thought they had outsmarted a simpleton. They had absolutely no idea what kind of monster they had just invited into their lives. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. I pulled my cell phone from my damp pocket, scrolled through my contacts, and tapped the name of a man who never slept. The line rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. "Jonathan." I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Wake up. We have a hunt." The line was quiet for a fraction of a second before Jonathan replied. His voice was sharp, instantly alert. "What do we need, Richard? Give me the target." I did not mince my words. I told him I needed a complete top-to-bottom financial audit of the entire Kensington family estate. I wanted to see every mortgage, every hidden line of credit, every shell company, and every single debt they owed to anyone on this planet. I want it entirely off the books, Jonathan, I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. No legal letters of inquiry, no formal warnings, no paper trails that could tip them off. Pure reconnaissance. I want to know exactly how much they are worth, and more importantly, exactly who they owe money to. Jonathan let out a low whistle. "You are pulling out the big guns for a wedding dispute, Richard. Are you sure you want to go this deep?" "It is not a wedding dispute anymore," I replied coldly. "I believe my daughter is being systematically robbed. Have the preliminary results on my desk by sunrise." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the cheap laminate nightstand. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the dark watching the headlights of passing trucks slice through the heavy rain, methodically plotting my next moves. I was a man who built a global logistics empire by predicting supply chain failures before they happened. I knew how to identify a structural weakness and exploit it. If Preston Kensington thought he could orchestrate a hostile takeover of my daughter's life, he was about to learn a very painful lesson in corporate warfare. When dawn finally broke, painting the stormy Boston sky in shades of gray, I opened my canvas duffel bags. I ignored the expensive tailored suits I had packed for the wedding weekend festivities. Instead, I reached past them and pulled out my old faded canvas mechanic overalls. They were stained with oil and worn at the knees. They were the exact clothes I used to wear 40 years ago when I was working 16-hour shifts in a freezing garage to put food on the table for Sarah. They were a reminder of where I came from, a reminder of the grit and absolute relentless drive that built my fortune. I put them on, laced up my heavy work boots, and grabbed my jacket. I left the dismal motel room and climbed back into my battered Ford pickup truck. The morning traffic was dense, but my focus was entirely unshaken. I navigated the busy city streets, heading straight for the financial district. I was driving toward the main executive branch of First Heritage Trust, the elite institution that held Sarah's $10 million account. I parked my rusty truck directly in front of the gleaming glass skyscraper, ignoring the frantic protests of the suited valet. I tossed him a $100 bill and told him to keep it running. I walked through the towering revolving doors and stepped into the immaculate marble lobby of the bank. The atmosphere was hushed and highly exclusive. Wealthy clients in tailored suits spoke in quiet, privileged tones. My arrival caused an immediate ripple of visible discomfort. I walked directly to the main reception desk, my heavy boots thudding loudly against the pristine floor. A young receptionist with perfect posture and a condescending smile looked up at me. "Sir, the delivery entrance is around the back of the building," she said smoothly, clearly assuming I was a maintenance worker. "I am not here to fix the plumbing," I replied evenly. "I am here to see the branch manager. Now." The receptionist offered a tight, dismissive laugh. "I am sorry, sir, but the executive manager only meets with our premium-tier clients, and only by strict prior appointment. I am going to have to ask you to step aside." I did not argue. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my overalls and pulled out a solid, matte black titanium card. It was an Apex Tier Founder credential, an ultra-exclusive identification reserved only for individuals with liquid assets exceeding $1 billion within their global banking network. It was a card that demanded immediate, unquestioning obedience. I placed it gently on the polished marble counter. The receptionist glanced down at it. Her polite, condescending smile instantly vanished. The color completely drained from her face as she recognized the rare insignia. Her hands began to physically tremble as she picked up her desk phone. "Right away, Mr. Caldwell," she stammered, her voice shaking with sudden terror. "I will have him down here immediately." Less than 2 minutes later, the branch manager came practically sprinting across the sprawling lobby. He was a man in a gray suit wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked absolutely terrified. "Mr. Caldwell," he gasped, breathless. "It is an absolute honor to have you in our branch. Please come with me to the executive suite. Whatever you need, consider it done." He quickly escorted me past the staring clients and the bewildered receptionist, leading me into a private, soundproof office with a sweeping view of the Boston skyline. He securely locked the door behind us and gestured to a plush leather chair. I did not sit down. I stood towering over his large mahogany desk. 2 weeks ago, I said, skipping pleasantries, my daughter Sarah Caldwell signed a document handled by this branch. Her new husband, Preston Kensington, facilitated it. He told her it was a routine tax disclosure for a marital status update on her trust fund. I want to see exactly what she signed. The manager swallowed hard, shuffling through his terminal. "Yes, sir, of course. We processed a document for Miss Caldwell last week." Let me pull up the digitized file for you. He turned his monitor around so I could see the high-resolution scan of the document. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. My heart instantly turned to absolute ice. The document was not a simple tax disclosure form. The manager wiped his brow again, clearly sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Sir, the document she signed was a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney. It granted Mr. Preston Kensington absolute control over the entirety of her $10 million trust fund. He now has the full legal authority to liquidate, transfer, or manage those assets without her direct consent. The sickening reality of Preston's grand design crashed down on me. He had used her blind trust to execute a flawless financial ambush. The wedding was merely a tool to gain access. Tell me you have not processed any major transactions on that account. I demanded, my voice cold enough to freeze the air in the room. The manager's hands shook violently over his keyboard as he opened the transaction ledger. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sheer panic. Mr. Caldwell, he whispered, his voice cracking. Mr. Kensington submitted an urgent authorization late last night. He requested a total expedited wire transfer of the full $10 million. The funds are scheduled to be moved to an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The wire is legally set to clear our clearinghouse at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I glanced at the large silver clock ticking softly on the office wall. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. I stared at the silver clock on the wall as the second hand ticked forward in the stifling silence of the executive suite. It was exactly 8:45. We had precisely 15 minutes before $10 million of my daughter's future vanished into an offshore abyss. The bank manager sat paralyzed behind his mahogany desk, waiting for my command. I did not panic. When you have spent decades building a global logistics empire, you learn that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. I leaned over his desk, planting both my calloused hands flat on the polished wood. Cancel the wire transfer. I said, my tone low and absolute. Freeze the entire account immediately. The manager swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between my face and his monitor. Mr. Caldwell, he stammered, his hands hovering over the keyboard. I completely understand your concern, but this document is a legally binding power of attorney. If I freeze a $10 million trust without a direct court order, Mr. Kensington could sue this institution for breach of fiduciary duty. He could have my job. I stared at him with a coldness that made the temperature drop. I am the original grantor of that trust, I reminded him quietly. And as the founder holding an Apex tier credential, I am personally instructing you to enact an emergency security freeze on the grounds of suspected criminal fraud. If you execute that wire transfer today, my legal team will entirely dismantle this branch by sunset. I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again. Now freeze the account. The manager nodded rapidly, a bead of sweat tracing down his cheek. He turned back to his terminal and began typing with furious speed. The loud clacking of his keyboard filled the room as the clock ticked closer to 9. I watched the screen. Security overrides were activated. Red warning banners flashed across his display. Finally, he hit the enter key one last time and let out a shaky breath. It is done, sir, he whispered. The offshore transfer has been aborted. The trust fund is now under a hard administrative lock. No funds can move without your physical presence and biometric authorization. I nodded slowly. Thank you, I said calmly. You just saved your own career. Before the manager could offer another nervous apology, my cell phone began to vibrate in the chest pocket of my mechanic overalls. I pulled it out and saw Jonathan's name flashing on the screen. It was time for the audit results. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the window, looking out over the gray, rain-soaked streets of Boston. I answered the call, keeping my voice hushed. Jonathan, tell me you have something. I have everything, Richard, Jonathan replied. His voice was sharp, professional, and devoid of emotion. And it is much worse than we anticipated. You were right to order the stealth audit. The Kensington family is completely broke. I frowned, watching the tiny cars navigate the morning traffic far below. "Define broke," I asked. "I need the exact numbers." "They are insolvent," Jonathan stated flatly. "The aristocratic image they project to Boston high society is nothing but a carefully constructed illusion. Their ancestral mansion is heavily mortgaged. Their luxury cars are leased. Victor Kensington's primary investment firm has not turned a legitimate profit in over 4 years. They have been moving money around to cover up massive losses in bad real estate ventures. But that is not even the worst part." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Go on." "When the traditional banks cut them off." Victor and Preston turned to alternative lending sources, Jonathan explained, lowering his voice. "They borrowed heavily from an underground lending syndicate operating out of the East Coast. Unregulated, undocumented, and highly dangerous money. The Kensingtons are currently $25 million in the hole, and this syndicate is demanding immediate repayment. If they default, they will lose everything. The estate, the cars, the fake prestige. They will be ruined and likely facing severe physical threats from their new creditors." I closed my eyes as a wave of pure fury washed over me. $25 million in debt to underground criminals, and my daughter had unknowingly walked right into the center of their desperate sinking ship. This was the reason for the lavish wedding. This was the reason they insisted on managing the event planning. It was all a grand theatrical performance designed to mask their absolute financial ruin. The pieces of their sickening puzzle were perfectly aligned. Preston had never loved Sarah. He had simply identified a naive, wealthy target with a $10 million safety net attached to her name. He spent 6 months isolating her from her friends, her family, and me. He rushed the wedding to solidify his legal standing as her husband. The moment the rings were on their fingers, he forged a power of attorney to drain her trust fund to pay off his family's massive debts. Sarah was not a bride to them. She was a hostage and a convenient piggy bank to these desperate frauds. The calculated cruelty of their plan made my blood run cold. Victor throwing that freezing water in my face was the final step to sever Sarah's last line of defense. They needed me humiliated and banished so they could execute their theft in total silence. I took a deep breath, letting the anger crystallize into a clear tactical focus. "Send me the complete financial dossier, Jonathan," I ordered. "Every single shell company, every hidden debt, and the exact names of the syndicate members holding their markers. We are going to buy them out." Jonathan paused for a fraction of a second. "Understood, Richard. I will send the encrypted files immediately." I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The bank manager was still sitting quietly behind his desk, watching me with awe and terror. I did not offer him an explanation. I simply turned around and walked out of the executive suite, my heavy work boots echoing down the silent marble hallway. I had stopped the immediate theft, but the war was only just beginning. The Kensingtons needed $25 million to survive, and they had just made the catastrophic mistake of targeting the only man who could crush them with a single phone call. I reached the main lobby and pushed through the revolving doors, stepping back out into the freezing rain. My old truck was still idling at the curb. I climbed inside, shutting the heavy door to block out the noise of the city. I was reaching for the gear shift when my cell phone vibrated against my chest. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was Sarah. My heart leaped with a sudden, desperate hope. Perhaps she had realized the truth. Perhaps she had seen through Preston's facade and was calling to ask for my help. I answered the call immediately, holding the phone tight against my ear. "Sarah, sweetheart, are you all right?" The sound that came through the speaker shattered my hopeful delusion instantly. Sarah was not calling to apologize. She was sobbing hysterically, her breath catching in her throat as she struggled to speak. "Dad," she gasped, her voice trembling with heartbreak and rage. "How could you do this to me? Why are you trying to ruin my life? Preston was right about you. You are just a bitter old man, and you are trying to destroy my marriage because you were kicked out of the wedding." My stomach dropped completely. Preston had already found out about the frozen trust fund, and rather than accepting defeat, that manipulative coward had sprinted back to my daughter and spun a devastating lie, perfectly weaponizing my own protective actions against me. The sharp, jagged edge of my daughter's voice cut through the heavy silence of the truck cab like a physical blade. I sat there in the driver's seat, the engine humming quietly beneath me, gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. Sarah had never spoken to me with such venom. Never in her 28 years of life had she directed this kind of raw, unfiltered hatred toward the man who raised her. Her words came out in rapid, breathless sobs, each one designed to inflict maximum damage. She accused me of being a bitter, resentful old man who simply could not stand to see her happy. She claimed that my bruised ego was the only reason I had authorized the bank freeze, stating that I was throwing a pathetic tantrum just because Victor had rightfully kicked me out of her perfect wedding reception. Dad, how could you do something so unspeakably evil? She wept, her breath hitching painfully against the microphone of her phone. Preston told me everything. He told me how you sneaked into the bank this morning like a thief. He told me you used a legal loophole to lock down the trust fund you gave me. You gave that money to me, Dad. It was supposed to be my safety net, my future with my husband. And the very morning after our wedding, the morning after you embarrassed yourself in front of his entire family, you try to steal it back out of pure spite. You are punishing me because you do not fit into my new life. I closed my eyes, letting the freezing chill of the damp cab seep into my skin. Preston was a master of psychological warfare. He had not just intercepted my countermeasure, he had seamlessly integrated it into his own narrative of victimhood. I could perfectly picture him standing in their opulent bridal suite, holding Sarah in his arms, playing the role of the devoted, deeply wounded husband. He had flawlessly convinced her that my emergency intervention was actually an act of malicious theft. Preston was just trying to secure our future. Sarah continued, her voice growing louder, fueled by a manufactured righteous anger that Preston had carefully planted inside her mind. He was trying to consolidate our assets into a joint family account so we could buy our first home together. He was doing exactly what a protective husband is supposed to do. And you intentionally sabotaged it because you cannot stand the fact that another man is taking care of me now. You are jealous, Dad. You are jealous and toxic and mean. Every syllable was a carefully crafted lie, orchestrated by Preston to burn the bridge between a father and his daughter. I wanted to scream the truth through the phone. I wanted to yell that the man she just married was a bankrupt fraud, heavily indebted to dangerous underground criminals. I wanted to explain that Preston was planning to wire her entire fortune to an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands, leaving her absolutely penniless. But as I listened to the unyielding conviction in her tearful voice, a terrifying realization settled over me like a heavy shroud. Telling her the truth right now would be completely useless. Preston had already inoculated her against anything I might say. He had built an impenetrable fortress of deceit around her mind. If I presented the audit results, Preston would simply claim I had forged the documents to frame him. If I told her about the offshore account, he would say it was a legitimate overseas investment opportunity that I was deliberately misunderstanding. He had spent 6 months isolating her from my influence, isolating her from reality. She was entirely under his spell. The more I fought back with words, the more I would validate Preston's lie that I was a crazed, jealous father trying to destroy her happiness. Preston says he cannot build a life with a woman whose family is actively trying to sabotage him, Sarah sobbed, delivering the final devastating blow. He told me that if I do not fix this, if I do not force you to release the funds by noon today, he is going to file for an annulment. He says he will divorce me, Dad. The man I love is going to leave me because you are a toxic, controlling old man who cannot let go. If you do not unlock my account right now, I will never speak to you again. I will completely cut you out of my life. You will be dead to me. The threat hung in the dead air of the truck cab. Preston was using the absolute highest level of emotional extortion. He was holding her marriage hostage, demanding the $10 million as the ransom, and forcing Sarah to hold the gun to my head. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it was going to fail spectacularly. I realized in that agonizing moment that a father's love sometimes requires stepping into the shadows. I could not save Sarah by arguing with her. I could not break Preston's psychological hold with logic or tears or pleas. She needed to witness his betrayal with her own eyes. She needed to feel the flames of his burning empire to understand that I was the only one trying to pull her from the fire. I had to let her hate me for a little while longer so that I could ultimately save her life. I took a slow, deep breath, burying my pain, burying my fatherly instinct to comfort her, and replacing it with the cold, calculating detachment of a corporate titan. "I am sorry you feel that way, Sarah," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any sorrow. It was a flat, chillingly deadpan response. There was a sudden, stunned silence on the other end of the line. She had clearly expected me to beg, to plead, to desperately try to explain myself. She had expected the emotional reaction of a loving father. Instead, she got the ice-cold indifference of a billionaire executive closing a bad deal. "Wait, what?" Sarah stammered, her confusion briefly overriding her anger. "Dad, did you hear what I just said? Preston is going to leave me. You have to undo the bank freeze. You have to fix this right now." "I have made my business decision regarding the trust," I replied, my tone remaining perfectly level. "The funds will remain locked." "Goodbye, Sarah." I pressed the red button on my screen, immediately cutting the connection. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel, allowing myself exactly 10 seconds to feel the crushing, agonizing weight of what I had just done. I had just willingly pushed my only child away. I had deliberately confirmed her worst fears about me, but it was the only way to shield the money and force Preston's hand. The clock was ticking, and Preston Kensington was running out of time. I turned the key in the ignition, and the old engine roared to life. I drove straight to Cole Logistics, bypassing the lobby, and taking the private elevator directly to my suite. Jonathan was waiting at the mahogany table surrounded by the financial dossiers. I looked down at the sprawling documents. I turned to Jonathan. "They want to play Wall Street. Fine. Buy their debt. All of it." The sheer scale of my directive hung in the quiet air. Jonathan did not blink. He nodded, his fingers flying across his encrypted tablet. Buying underground syndicate debt was not a standard maneuver, but Cole Logistics had never operated within standard expectations. We had the capital, the shadow networks, and the ruthless efficiency to execute the acquisition before the sun reached its peak. But simply owning their debt was not enough. I did not just want to hold their leash. I wanted them to willingly hand it to me, believing it was a lifeline. I needed to construct a flawless illusion, a mirage so perfect that their arrogant desperation would blind them to the trap. The Kensingtons were drowning, suffocating under a $25 million syndicate loan. The frozen trust fund had completely severed their oxygen supply. They were a family built entirely on appearances, terrified of public ruin. I knew Victor and Preston were frantically searching the globe for untraceable cash to save their hollow empire. So we gave them exactly what they were looking for. Over the next 48 hours, Jonathan and I meticulously fabricated a phantom entity from thin air. We named it Apex Global. On paper, it was a secretive private equity firm based out of Geneva, specializing in distressed asset acquisitions. We established an impenetrable corporate shell, complete with registered offshore holding accounts, legally binding non-disclosure agreements, and a digitally generated corporate history that could withstand a standard background check. We built a flawless ghost ship specifically designed to lure the Kensingtons into the open waters of a massive financial transaction. Once the digital architecture of Apex Global was firmly established, it was time to cast the line. I instructed Jonathan to utilize a heavily encrypted intermediary to reach out directly to Victor Kensington. The approach had to be carefully calibrated to stroke his massive ego while simultaneously exploiting his quiet terror. We did not send a generic inquiry. We sent a highly confidential, remarkably specific letter of intent. Apex Global expressed a sudden aggressive interest in acquiring the entirety of the Kensington family real estate portfolio. We framed it as a strategic continental expansion, citing their historic properties as prime targets for luxury redevelopment. We praised Victor's legacy in the Boston market, feeding his aristocratic delusions. And then we dropped the golden anchor. The initial buyout offer was set at exactly $30 million. It was a calculated, deliberate number. It was just enough to completely wipe out their $25 million underground syndicate debt, while leaving them a comfortable $5 million cushion to maintain their lavish, fake aristocratic lifestyle. It was an offer so flawlessly aligned with their immediate desperate needs that it bordered on the miraculous. I knew exactly how Victor would react. A drowning man does not stop to question the structural integrity of the life preserver suddenly tossed in his direction. He simply grabs it with both hands and holds on for dear life. I sat in my office staring at the gray skyline, waiting for the inevitable response. I did not wait long. Less than 3 hours after Jonathan transmitted the secure letter of intent, my private terminal chimed with an incoming communication. Victor Kensington bypassed his own legal counsel and responded directly to the Apex Global intermediary. His message was a masterclass in poorly disguised desperation wrapped in false confidence. He attempted to project the casual indifference of a wealthy patriarch, fielding a minor business inquiry, stating that while their portfolio was not actively listed, he was always willing to entertain a lucrative international transaction. He completely ignored standard due diligence procedures. He did not ask for references, he did not demand a verified proof of funds, and he certainly did not question why a foreign entity was suddenly willing to vastly overpay for failing real estate assets. He was blinded by the $30 million figure. It was the ultimate cure for his impending destruction. Victor eagerly agreed to our strict terms of absolute confidentiality and demanded an in-person meeting as soon as humanly possible. Jonathan expertly played the role of the elusive foreign broker, making them wait just long enough to let their anxiety simmer. After a day of calculated silence, we finally agreed to a face-to-face negotiation. We set the meeting for Friday afternoon in a private high-security penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton. It was a neutral ground, perfectly chosen to make Victor and Preston feel as though they were still in control of their crumbling destiny. Friday arrived with a heavy, oppressive, overcast sky threatening rain over Boston. I did not wear my tailored executive suits or dress as the billionaire founder of a global empire. I wore my faded, oil-stained mechanic overalls, a heavy canvas jacket, and a worn baseball cap pulled low over my brow. I drove an unmarked gray surveillance van into the loading dock alley, directly across the street from the luxurious hotel. The back of the van was outfitted with state-of-the-art audio reception equipment, glowing with dozens of small green lights. I sat in the hard metal chair surrounded by screens, staring intently at the ornate stone facade of the building across the street. I was not going into that penthouse suite. My presence would trigger their defensive instincts and detonate the entire operation. Instead, I sent Jonathan. He was the perfect proxy, a ruthless, brilliant legal predator dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, carrying an aura of absolute uncompromising authority. He looked exactly like the senior acquisition director of a predatory foreign equity firm. Inside Jonathan's sleek black leather briefcase, securely fastened beneath the velvet lining, was a military-grade hidden microphone. It was synced directly to the receiver in my van, providing a crystal-clear audio feed of every single breath taken inside that room. I watched through a pair of heavy binoculars as Victor and Preston arrived at the hotel entrance. They stepped out of a leased black town car wearing expensive, immaculate suits, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to collapse. They walked through the brass revolving doors, their posture rigid, projecting an image of total confidence while marching directly into my slaughterhouse. I adjusted the heavy headphones over my ears, turning the volume dial up until I could hear the faint, ambient hum of the hotel elevator carrying them upward. My pulse was steady, drumming a slow, methodical rhythm against my ribs. I had them exactly where I wanted them. They believed they were walking into a room to secure their financial salvation. They believed they were about to outsmart the system and regain control of my daughter's stolen future. They had spent the entire week spinning malicious lies, gaslighting Sarah, and manipulating her grief to paint me as the villain. They thought they had removed me from the chessboard. I leaned forward in the dark van, staring at the blinking green audio wave on my monitor. The sound of a heavy wooden door clicking open echoed loudly through my headphones. I heard the sharp, confident footsteps of my lawyer echoing across the hardwood floor of the penthouse. "Welcome to Boston, gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with cool, professional detachment. "Please have a seat. We have $30 million to discuss." I sat back in the shadows, my hand resting on the console, completely ready to tear their fake world down to the absolute bedrock. The static hum of the encrypted audio feed was the only sound in the dark surveillance van. I sat perfectly still, the heavy headphones pressing tightly against my ears, listening as Jonathan masterfully took command of the penthouse suite. I could hear the faint rustle of thick paper as Jonathan deliberately opened his leather briefcase, followed by the soft clinking of ice against crystal. Victor Kensington was already pouring himself a drink from the hotel minibar. It was a subtle tell, a small sign of the immense pressure cracking the foundation of his carefully constructed facade. Jonathan did not accept the offer of a beverage. He wasted absolutely no time on standard corporate pleasantries. His voice, transmitted cleanly through the hidden microphone, was a chilling instrument of pure authority. He introduced himself as the Senior Acquisition Director for Apex Global, stating that his time was incredibly valuable and that he had flown across the Atlantic solely to close this specific deal. I could hear the faint squeak of expensive leather as Victor and Preston hurriedly took their seats across from him. They were eager, practically vibrating, with the desperate need to secure the $30 million. Jonathan began the interrogation with a simple, devastating question. He asked them why a family with such a supposedly rich historic legacy in Boston high society was suddenly eager to liquidate their entire foundational real estate portfolio in a matter of days. Victor attempted to answer, first projecting a tone of casual, aristocratic indifference. He cleared his throat and confidently stated that the Kensington family was simply looking to pivot their investments toward emerging international markets. He used hollow corporate buzzwords, claiming that the local real estate market was stagnating and that this fire sale was merely a strategic repositioning of their liquid assets. Jonathan let a heavy, oppressive silence fill the room before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with deep skepticism. He told Victor that Apex Global did not deal in fairy tales. He stated that a $30 million expedited buyout required absolute transparency, and he bluntly accused Victor of hiding a massive toxic liability. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, predatory register. He told them he knew about the underground lending syndicate. He bluffed flawlessly, implying that Geneva had heard whispers of the Kensingtons swimming in highly dangerous, unregulated debt. I heard Victor completely choke on his scotch. A wet, coughing gasp echoed through my headphones, followed by the frantic sound of Preston trying to intervene. The sophisticated illusion of the Kensington Empire instantly shattered inside that penthouse. Jonathan pressed his advantage mercilessly, demanding to know exactly how deep in the hole they were, and why Apex Global should risk bailing them out of a mob-affiliated disaster. Preston, desperate to salvage the negotiation and prove they were still capable players, aggressively took the reins of the conversation. He admitted to a temporary cash flow issue, framing the $25 million syndicate debt as a minor unfortunate oversight in an otherwise brilliant investment strategy. He tried to project an aura of total ruthlessness, assuring Jonathan that the Kensingtons were more than willing to do whatever was necessary to protect their wealth and honor their obligations. To demonstrate his point, to prove just how untouchable and superior his family truly was, Victor chimed back in with a sickeningly arrogant laugh. He wanted to show the Geneva shark that they possessed the stomach for cruelty. Victor boasted about how he handled nuisances. He proudly recounted the events of the wedding night. I sat in the freezing van, my jaw locked tight, as I listened to Victor gleefully describe how he threw a glass of ice water directly into the face of his new daughter-in-law's father in front of 900 elite guests. He laughed a cruel wheezing sound, calling me a pathetic, uncultured grease monkey who did not know his place. The idiot actually apologized before he left. Victor sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. He just stood there dripping wet and took it like a beaten dog. That is how we handle weak people who step into our world. We crush them and discard them. The sound of their shared laughter physically sickened me, but Jonathan remained entirely unfazed. He coldly cut through their arrogant boasting, steering the trap toward its final, devastating conclusion. He stated that a willingness to humiliate a blue-collar worker was not sufficient collateral for a $30 million bailout. Jonathan demanded hard guarantees. If the real estate transfer encountered any legal delays, he asked what other liquid assets did they possess to secure the bridge loan. Preston, eager to prove his worth and secure the cash, proudly laid his darkest secret entirely bare. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, unaware that he was speaking directly into my ear. He confidently told Jonathan that he had absolute, uncontested access to his new wife's $10 million trust fund. But Jonathan pushed back, questioning the legality of seizing a spouse's separate assets. Preston let out a low, sinister chuckle that made my blood freeze in my veins. He assured Jonathan that his new wife was incredibly naive and completely isolated. He explained that she had already signed a comprehensive power of attorney without reading a single word. But then Preston revealed the true depth of his monstrous design. He bragged that the trust fund was only the beginning. He proudly detailed his systematic plan to heavily medicate Sarah, deliberately gaslight her into a severe emotional breakdown, and ultimately file for full legal conservatorship over her entire life. Preston spoke with the cold, detached precision of a slaughterhouse butcher. He boasted that within 6 months he would have her declared completely emotionally unstable and unfit to manage her own affairs. He assured Jonathan that there would be absolutely no legal interference from her family. "Her father is a broken-down, stupid mechanic," Preston sneered confidently into the hidden microphone. "He lives in a pathetic little house and barely scrapes by on a pension. Even if the old fool suspects anything, he is far too poor and ignorant to afford a lawyer to fight us in probate court. We will have total control over her mind, her body, and every single dime she owns." I sat alone in the dark surveillance van, the pouring rain hammering relentlessly against the metal roof above my head. I gripped the heavy leather steering wheel with both hands, squeezing until my knuckles turned a stark, bruised shade of white. The sickening weight of Preston's true intentions settled onto my chest like a block of solid concrete. I had initially thought this was merely a hostile financial takeover. I had thought they were just greedy aristocrats trying to steal a $10 million trust fund to pay off their dangerous debts. But the horrifying reality echoing through my headphones was infinitely worse. This was not just theft. It was the calculated, systematic psychological destruction of my only child. They intended to break her mind, enslave her, and discard her when they were done. I slowly reached up and pulled the headphones off my ears, the cruel sound of Preston's laughter fading into the quiet hum of the surveillance equipment. The game of mere financial chess was officially over. The game of mere financial chess was officially over. Inside the luxurious penthouse suite, the air grew thick with an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Jonathan, playing his role with flawless precision, steepled his fingers and stared blankly at Preston. He did not immediately respond to the horrifying admission regarding Sarah's trust fund. He simply let the absolute moral bankruptcy of Preston's words hang in the room, acting as though he was coldly evaluating the legal viability of this twisted collateral. Victor Kensington remained seated, looking smug, completely unaware of the monster he had raised. The negotiation was nearing a critical juncture when a sudden, sharp trill shattered the quiet. It was Preston's cell phone. He pulled it from his tailored jacket pocket, glancing at the caller identification. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. His arrogant confidence briefly vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine urgency. He quickly silenced the ringer and offered Jonathan a tight, apologetic smile. "Excuse me for just one moment, gentlemen," Preston said smoothly, standing up from the leather chair. "It is an urgent matter regarding the wedding venue logistics. I need to take this outside." He turned and walked briskly toward the suite's private balcony, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind him. He thought he was perfectly isolated. He thought he had successfully created a barrier between his public lies and his private reality. But he had fundamentally underestimated the sophisticated technology sitting directly beneath Jonathan's chair. The military-grade hidden microphone in the briefcase was not just a basic recording device. It was a high-frequency parabolic receiver designed to penetrate solid barriers and amplify isolated sound waves. In the dark surveillance van, I turned the amplification dial up to its absolute maximum limit. A sharp burst of static crackled through my headphones, quickly resolving into the crisp, distinct sound of the cold Boston wind whipping across the balcony. Then I heard Preston's voice. The smooth, charming tone he used with my daughter and his father was completely gone. He spoke with a rushed, desperate intimacy. "Chloe, I told you absolutely never to call me during business hours," he hissed into the receiver. The name hit me like a physical strike. Chloe. This was not a wedding vendor. This was a hidden life. I sat paralyzed, listening as the final, most devastating layer of Preston's deception was ruthlessly peeled away. The faint, tinny sound of a woman's voice bled through the connection, her tone frantic and upset. Preston let out a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I know it is difficult, baby," he murmured, his voice softening into a sickeningly genuine display of affection. "I know you and Leo are tired of waiting. Tell my little boy that Daddy is working as fast as he can." My breath caught sharply in my throat. A little boy. A 3-year-old son named Leo. Preston Kensington, the man who had just stood at an altar and pledged his eternal devotion to my daughter, had a secret family hidden entirely in the shadows. He had a mistress. He had a child. The depth of his sociopathy was practically unfathomable. "Just give me exactly 6 more months," Preston pleaded with the woman on the phone, his voice dripping with a poisonous sincerity. "The wedding is completely finished. I have her legally bound to me. I just finalized the power of attorney paperwork yesterday. She suspects absolutely nothing. As soon as I get this massive equity deal closed today, I will have enough liquid capital to cover my father's ridiculous syndicate debts and get him off my back. Then I am going to initiate the next phase. I am going to start filtering her trust fund into the private Cayman accounts. I am already slowly increasing her anxiety medications. Once her account is completely drained, I will trigger a severe emotional breakdown, declare her mentally unfit, and have her permanently committed to a private psychiatric facility upstate. I promise you, Chloe, the very second she is locked away in a ward, I am buying our tickets. We will take Leo, we will fly straight to Zurich, and we will finally be a real family." The glass balcony door slid open, cutting off the rest of his sickening promise. Preston walked back into the penthouse suite, sliding his phone into his pocket and seamlessly reattaching his flawless, aristocratic mask. He apologized to Jonathan for the interruption, smoothly claiming it was merely a catering dispute regarding the leftover wedding champagne. He sat back down, ready to resume his negotiations for a $30 million bailout, entirely confident that his grand, monstrous design was proceeding exactly as planned. Inside the cramped surveillance van, a profound, terrifying silence washed over me. The burning, explosive rage that had been boiling in my blood for the last 48 hours suddenly evaporated. It did not disappear. It compressed. It condensed into something infinitely more dangerous. It transformed into a lethal, surgical calm. My breathing slowed to a steady, even rhythm. The erratic pounding of my heart settled into a cold, methodical beat. When you are blinded by anger, you make reckless mistakes. When you are furious, you act on impulse and give your enemy an opening to strike back. But when you reach this state of absolute chilling clarity, you stop fighting a battle and you start orchestrating an execution. Preston Kensington was not merely a greedy opportunist trying to steal a trust fund. He was a ruthless, calculating predator actively hunting my child. He viewed Sarah as a disposable resource, a piece of meat to be drained of its value and thrown into a psychiatric cage so he could fund a luxurious life in Europe with his secret family. He had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of financial chess against a wealthy, gullible bride. He did not realize he had just declared war on a man who possessed the unlimited capital and the sheer unyielding will to absolutely eradicate his entire bloodline from the face of the earth. The time for reconnaissance was officially over. The intelligence-gathering phase was complete. I had seen every hidden card in their hand. I knew their weaknesses, their debts, their secrets, and their darkest, most vile intentions. It was time to spring the trap. I reached toward the encrypted communication console mounted on the dashboard of the van. I pressed the secure channel button that linked directly to Jonathan's concealed earpiece. The small green light on the console flared to life, indicating the connection was open and completely secure. Inside the penthouse, Jonathan subtly shifted his posture imperceptibly, acknowledging the incoming transmission without breaking his intense eye contact with Victor Kensington. The two aristocratic frauds sat eagerly across the mahogany table, practically salivating at the prospect of walking out of that room with $30 million of foreign equity capital. They were completely ready to sign their souls away to save their miserable fake empire. I leaned intimately close to the microphone on the dashboard. My voice was a soft, deadly whisper cold enough to freeze the marrow in their bones. "Jonathan," I said, delivering the final fatal command. "We have heard exactly what we needed to hear. The evaluation process is now officially concluded. They want to play Wall Street. Fine. Execute the buyout. But do not buy their company. Buy the underground debt. All of it. We will own them completely." Jonathan did not hesitate. "When you command an attorney of his caliber to execute a hostile financial maneuver, you get immediate results." Jonathan simply nodded into his hidden microphone, maintained his steely composure in front of Victor and Preston, and flawlessly concluded the meeting. He told them Apex Global would review their internal liquidity and be in touch shortly. He left them sitting in that penthouse suite, blindly celebrating a salvation that was actually their execution. The moment Jonathan stepped out of the hotel, my machinery went into overdrive. Buying illegal underground syndicate debt is not a standard transaction. It requires intense leverage, severe intimidation, and an overwhelming display of superior force. Jonathan immediately contacted his quiet associates within the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We did not ask for a favor. We offered a highly lucrative trade. We provided the federal agents with the exact unredacted ledger of the syndicate's illicit lending operations in Boston, a massive ledger we had uncovered during our deep dive audit. In exchange, the feds agreed to look the other way for 24 hours while we conducted a private acquisition. With the federal hammer hanging directly over the heads of the syndicate bosses, Jonathan arranged a midnight meeting in a private, heavily guarded hangar at Logan Airport. He did not negotiate with the underground lenders. He simply informed them that their entire operation was fatally exposed and the federal government was preparing to seize every single asset they possessed. He then offered them a one-time non-negotiable exit strategy. Apex Global would purchase the Kensington family debt at 60 cents on the dollar, paid in untraceable bearer bonds, provided they signed over all collateral rights immediately. The syndicate bosses, terrified of federal prison and eager to cut their massive losses on a toxic, high-profile asset, like the arrogant Kensingtons, took the money and ran without a second thought. By the time the sun rose over Boston the following morning, the reversal was absolute. The ink on the transfer deeds was completely dry. I sat at the grand mahogany desk in my corporate office holding a thick, bound leather folder. Inside that folder was the absolute totality of the Kensington family legacy. I now held the primary mortgage on their sprawling ancestral mansion. I held the titles to their leased fleet of luxury European vehicles. I held the markers on Victor Kensington's failing investment firm. Overnight, I had become their sole undisputed legal creditor. They owed $25 million directly to me. I owned the roof over their heads, the ground they walked on, and the very air they breathed. I poured myself a glass of black coffee, savoring the profound silence of my office. My phone buzzed loudly on the desk. It was the secure audio feed still transmitting from the device Jonathan had managed to slip into Victor's coat pocket during their departure from the hotel. The audio crackled to life, picking up the unmistakable sounds of a celebration inside the Kensington estate. Ice clinked against expensive crystal. The pop of a vintage champagne cork loudly echoed through the receiver. Preston Victor shouted, his voice thick with unadulterated, triumphant jubilation. "Do you hear this? Have you checked the family accounts this morning?" I heard Preston walk briskly into the room, his footsteps light and eager. "What is it, Dad? Did the Geneva firm finally send over the buyout contract?" Better Victor laughed loudly, a booming, arrogant sound that grated violently against my ears. "The syndicate debt is gone. It has been wiped from their ledgers. I just received a formal legal notice. Our markers were mysteriously transferred in the middle of the night. An anonymous corporate holding firm bought out the entire portfolio of underground loans. The mob is entirely out of the picture. We do not have those dangerous animals breathing down our necks anymore." Preston let out a breathless gasp of pure, unadulterated relief. He truly believed he had just dodged the ultimate bullet. A corporate holding firm. "That means we are dealing with legitimate bankers now, not thugs with baseball bats. Bankers who follow standard corporate timelines and bureaucratic legal procedures. Dad, this is an absolute miracle. It gives us all the breathing room we desperately need. I have Sarah completely under my control. The power of attorney is fully active. Within a few short weeks, I will have her entire trust fund fully liquidated, and we can pay off this faceless corporation at our own pace. We are saved. We are untouchable." I listened to them blindly congratulate themselves, entirely unaware of the lethal trap clamping tightly around their ankles. They thought they had traded a dangerous predator for a sluggish, bureaucratic banking institution. They thought they had bought themselves the luxury of time. They had no idea that the faceless corporation they were toasting to was controlled by the very man they had publicly humiliated and discarded in the freezing rain just days prior. They had no idea I was not a sluggish bank. I was a furious father fighting for his daughter's life, and I was going to rip their empire down to the studs. Their delusion reached its zenith by the end of the week. Intoxicated by their perceived victory and eager to project their untouchable wealth to Boston high society, Victor and Preston decided to host a massive event. They called it a post-wedding celebration, a grand gala at their estate designed to welcome Sarah into the family and solidify their aristocratic standing. In reality, it was a debt-free celebration, a lavish display of extreme arrogance funded by credit they no longer actually possessed. They hired the exact same expensive caterers. They booked the same classical string quartet. They ordered crates of imported caviar and towering floral arrangements. They were spending money with the reckless abandon of men who falsely believed they had successfully cheated death. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table of my modest suburban home, reviewing the final legal foreclosure documents Jonathan had drafted. I heard the sharp snap of the mail slot on my front door. I walked into the hallway and picked up a small stack of envelopes from the floor. Among the standard utility bills and local advertisements was a thick, heavy envelope made of premium ivory cardstock. My name, Richard Caldwell, was elegantly written across the front in sweeping golden calligraphy. I opened the envelope with a silver letter opener and pulled out the thick invitation. It was a formal request for my presence at the Kensington estate for a grand gala celebration. It was clearly a massive clerical error. In their frantic, arrogant rush to organize this elaborate party, they must have handed their wedding planner the master guest list from the previous week. They had accidentally invited the poor grease monkey they had so proudly banished. They had foolishly invited the very man they were actively plotting to destroy. I stood in my quiet hallway, staring at the golden letters dancing across the expensive paper. I vividly pictured Preston whispering his dark promises to his mistress. I vividly pictured Victor laughing about the ice water. I pictured my beloved daughter confused and isolated, trapped in a dangerous house of vipers. I slowly folded the heavy ivory invitation and slipped it into the breast pocket of my faded mechanic overalls. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. I would not miss this party for the world. The following evening wrapped Boston in a crisp and unyielding chill. I steered my battered Ford truck up the winding, meticulously manicured road leading to the Kensington estate. I did not park in the circular cobblestone driveway where the valet attendants were eagerly rushing to open the doors of imported luxury sedans. Instead, I guided my heavy vehicle off the main path, parking in the deep, ink-black shadows cast by a row of ancient oak trees just beyond the perimeter gate. I turned off the engine and rolled down my window, letting the cold air wash over my face as I stared through the darkness at the glowing mansion. The sprawling stone estate was practically radiating with light and arrogant triumph. It was the exact same venue where I had been humiliated just 1 week prior, the exact same ground where Victor Kensington had thrown freezing water into my face and banished me into the rain. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows of the grand ballroom, I could see the swirling motion of Boston high society. The room was packed with the exact same elite guests who had watched my public degradation with silent, cowardly amusement. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and imported delicacies. The faint melodic notes of a classical string quartet drifted across the manicured lawns, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to an empire built entirely on stolen money and fraudulent prestige. They were celebrating a salvation that did not exist. They were toasting to a debt-free future, completely blind to the fact that their executioner was sitting quietly in the dark, just a few hundred yards away. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a pair of high-powered surveillance binoculars. I raised them to my eyes and slowly scanned the glittering crowd inside the ballroom. It did not take me long to find the host of the evening. Preston Kensington was standing on a raised marble dais at the far end of the room, holding a crystal glass high in the air. He was in the middle of delivering what appeared to be a grand, passionate speech. His handsome face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of his perceived victory. He was speaking about the strength of family, the endurance of legacy, and the limitless potential of his newly consolidated wealth. The aristocratic crowd was hanging on to his every fabricated word, completely entranced by the illusion of his success. But my focus immediately shifted away from Preston and locked onto the woman standing stiffly by his side. My heart seized painfully in my chest. Sarah looked absolutely horrific. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown, but the expensive silk only highlighted how rapidly she was wasting away. Her normally vibrant face was completely drained of color, leaving her skin an ashen, translucent white. Dark, heavy shadows bruised the delicate skin beneath her eyes. She looked entirely exhausted, hollowed out by days of relentless psychological manipulation and the heavy doses of anxiety medication Preston had undoubtedly forced upon her. She was not glowing with the joy of a new bride. She was trembling. She looked terrified, trapped, and entirely isolated in a room filled with hundreds of people. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars and saw Preston firmly wrap his hand around her upper arm. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a gesture of affectionate support. But I could see the agonizing tension in her thin shoulders. I could see the brutal, controlling tightness of his grip, his fingers digging into her fragile skin like a set of iron claws. He was physically anchoring her to the stage, parading his broken prize in front of his wealthy peers, silently gloating over the $10 million hostage he believed he had successfully conquered. The lethal surgical calm that had settled over me in the surveillance van solidified into something far more dangerous. The time for hiding in the shadows was completely over. I lowered the binoculars and placed them carefully onto the dashboard. I opened the door of my truck and stepped out into the freezing night air. But I was not wearing my faded canvas work jacket tonight. I was not wearing my oil-stained mechanic overalls or my scuffed work boots. The grease monkey that Victor Kensington had so arrogantly dismissed was entirely gone. I was wearing a custom-tailored $10,000 Tom Ford suit cut from the finest midnight blue wool. The crisp, immaculate fabric settled perfectly across my broad shoulders, radiating an aura of uncompromising, absolute authority. I adjusted the silk tie at my throat and buttoned the suit jacket with slow, deliberate precision. I stood beside my battered truck, the ultimate symbol of my working-class roots, wearing the armor of a corporate titan who could buy and sell the entire Kensington bloodline without a second thought. A few seconds later, the quiet rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the asphalt beneath my polished leather shoes. I turned my head and watched as two massive unmarked black sport utility vehicles glided silently up the winding road, their headlights turned completely off to avoid detection. They pulled onto the grass and parked in tight formation directly behind my truck. The doors of the lead vehicle swung open simultaneously. Jonathan stepped out into the cool air, dressed in a razor-sharp black suit, carrying the heavy leather folder that contained the irrefutable proof of their destruction. But Jonathan did not arrive alone. 4 broad-shouldered men stepped out of the second vehicle. They were not private security contractors. They were veteran federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with gold badges gleaming brightly against their chests. They moved with absolute silent discipline, projecting the terrifying reality of federal law enforcement. I had promised Jonathan that I would deliver the syndicate bosses, and in return, the federal government had agreed to assist me in executing the final phase of my legal takeover. We stood together in the shadows, a small, highly lethal army prepared to storm the gates of a fake aristocratic fortress. I looked at Jonathan and gave him a silent nod. We stepped from the cover of the ancient oak trees and began our march up the cobblestone driveway. The crunch of our footsteps echoed loudly in the evening air, an unstoppable rhythm announcing absolute ruin. As we approached the main entrance, 3 large private security guards in black suits stepped forward, raising their hands to block our path. The lead guard opened his mouth, preparing to order us off the property, but his words died in his throat. The 4 federal agents stepped smoothly past me, unzipping their dark windbreakers to reveal the holstered weapons and federal insignias resting on their hips. The security guards completely froze. Their aggressive posturing vanished, replaced by staggering terror. They slowly lowered their hands and backed away, surrendering the entrance. I did not even look at them as I walked past. I climbed the wide stone steps leading to the main foyer. I ignored the terrified gasp of the valet attendant standing nearby. I reached the grand mahogany doors of the ballroom. I did not knock. I did not wait for an invitation. I simply took one final breath, bracing myself for the impact. I raised my foot and kicked the heavy wooden doors violently open. The heavy wooden doors exploded inward with a deafening crash that echoed like a thunderclap across the vast vaulted ceiling of the ballroom. The sudden violent noise ripped through the elegant atmosphere, instantly shattering the sophisticated illusion of the evening. The classical string quartet, startled by the brutal intrusion, faltered and screeched to a halt, the sudden silence falling over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Hundreds of pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance, their expressions morphing from polite amusement to absolute shock. The elite guests of Boston high society, the very same people who had stood by and watched my public degradation a week prior, now stared in stunned disbelief at the man standing in the doorway. I did not shrink under their collective gaze. I stood tall, my suit radiating a dark, uncompromising power, flanked by Jonathan and the 4 silent, heavily armed federal agents. The sea of wealthy socialites parted instinctively, creating a wide, clear path down the center of the ballroom. At the far end of the room, standing frozen on the marble dais, Victor Kensington stared at me as if I were a ghost that had crawled out of an open grave. For a fraction of a second, I saw pure, unfiltered confusion in his eyes. Then the confusion rapidly warped into an explosive rage. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his pristine white collar. He abandoned his aristocratic poise and marched forward, his heavy footsteps echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. He stormed down the center aisle, closing the distance between us with purposeful strides. "You," Victor bellowed, his voice shaking with furious indignation. "How dare you show your face here? Get this trash out of my house!" He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, expecting me to cower, expecting me to bow my head and retreat into the cold night, just as I had done before. He was waiting for the apology, the submission, the ultimate validation of his superior status. But I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I remained perfectly still, radiating a cold, lethal calm that seemed to absorb the fiery heat of his anger. Beside me, a young waiter in a white uniform stood frozen in absolute terror, holding a silver tray laden with crystal glasses of iced water. Without breaking my gaze from Victor's furious face, I slowly reached out and lifted one of the heavy crystal goblets from the trembling waiter's tray. The condensation on the glass was ice cold against my fingertips. Victor stopped dead in his tracks just 3 feet away from me, his mouth opening to hurl another venomous insult. I did not give him the chance to speak. With a smooth, deliberate, and casual motion, I tipped the crystal glass forward. I poured the freezing ice-filled water directly onto Victor Kensington's Italian leather shoes. The water splashed loudly against the expensive leather, soaking the hems of his tailored trousers and pooling into a dark puddle on the pristine hardwood floor. A sharp collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Hundreds of wealthy socialites inhaled sharply, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the gesture. Victor stood absolutely rigid, looking down at his ruined shoes, his mind incapable of processing the insult. The exact parallel of his own cruel action hung heavily in the dead air. I had taken his signature humiliation and returned it with absolute chilling indifference. The grand, untouchable patriarch of the Kensington Empire had just been publicly disrespected in his own ballroom, and the aristocratic illusion was officially broken. Before Victor could recover from the paralyzing shock, Preston rushed forward, shoving his way through the stunned crowd. His handsome face was contorted with an ugly, desperate rage. He had spent the entire evening playing the prince, boasting about his newly acquired wealth and his secured legacy, and now his perfect narrative was actively bleeding out on the floor. He stepped protectively in front of his father, puffing out his chest, attempting to assert the dominance he falsely believed he possessed. I glanced past Preston's shoulder and locked eyes with Sarah. She was standing near the edge of the dais, her hands covering her mouth, her pale, exhausted face a portrait of absolute terror. She was trapped in the center of the nightmare, waiting for the violence to erupt. Preston jabbed an accusing finger toward my face, his voice cracking with a frantic energy. "Have you completely lost your mind, you pathetic old man?" Preston snarled, his words echoing loudly across the silent, breathless room. "You are trespassing on private property. I am going to have you thrown in a cell for this. I am calling the police right now, and I am going to make sure they lock you away for the rest of your miserable life." He reached aggressively into his tailored jacket. I let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a visible, terrifying shiver down his spine. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply tilted my head and gestured casually toward the deep shadows of the entryway behind me. "I brought them for you, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a finely sharpened blade. "Saves us the tedious wait." On my command, the 4 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division stepped smoothly out of the dim lighting and into the bright, sparkling glow of the chandelier. They unzipped their dark tactical windbreakers, fully revealing the gleaming gold badges and the heavy holstered weapons resting securely on their hips. The sight of federal law enforcement invading the elite sanctuary of Boston high society acted like a physical blow. The collective breath of the room vanished. The arrogant false fury draining so rapidly from Preston's flushed face was an absolute, undeniably breathtaking masterpiece of true, unfiltered human terror to behold. His eyes widened into massive panicked circles, his skin turning an unnatural shade of chalky white, as the reality of his criminal exposure crashed violently into his mind. He slowly lowered his trembling hand from his jacket, entirely paralyzed by the sudden presence of the agents. I did not stop to enjoy his fear. I stepped past the completely frozen, trembling bodies of Victor and Preston, moving with slow, methodical precision toward the massive, ornate dining table positioned in the center of the ballroom. The table was draped in heavy white silk and covered in silver platters of untouched caviar. Jonathan walked perfectly and silently by my right side, closely anticipating my every single calculated move. He opened his sleek black briefcase and handed me the thick red legal folder containing the absolute totality of the Kensington family destruction. I held the heavy folder in my right hand, feeling the weight of the deeds, the offshore accounts, the wiretap transcripts, and the foreclosures. I stopped at the edge of the dining table and turned to face Victor, who was still staring at his soaked shoes in a state of catatonic disbelief. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the thick red legal folder onto the grand dining table. It hit the polished mahogany beneath the silk with a loud, vicious crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. "You so incredibly arrogantly asked me to leave your house forever, Victor," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "But there is a slight problem with your eviction notice." I reached out and slowly flipped open the heavy cover of the red legal folder. The pristine white pages inside were covered in stark black ink, official government seals, and notarized signatures. I looked up from the documents and let my gaze sweep across the silent room. The faces of the Boston elite stared back at me, a sea of wealthy socialites who had spent their entire lives judging a book by its faded cover. They were about to receive a masterclass in reading the fine print. I turned my attention back to Victor Kensington, whose face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell of the arrogant patriarch who had humiliated me a week ago. "For the past year, you and your son have treated me like an ignorant, uncultured grease monkey," I began, my voice carrying a smooth, unyielding authority that filled every corner of the vast ballroom. "You assumed my grease-stained hands and my battered truck meant I was nothing more than a pathetic mechanic. But you never bothered to look past your own elitist prejudice. If you had done even a fraction of the due diligence required of a legitimate businessman, you would have discovered the truth. I am the founder, the chief executive, and the sole owner of Cole Logistics. We operate on 4 continents and move billions of dollars in freight every single quarter. I am worth more than this entire room combined." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of onlookers. The whispers began immediately, a low, buzzing murmur of shock and sudden realization, as the wealthy guests frantically reevaluated the man standing before them. Victor simply stared at me, his jaw trembling, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the documents resting on the table. "But that is only the first part of your grand miscalculation," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "As of yesterday morning, I am also the sole architect and owner of a highly discreet private equity firm based in Geneva, a firm known as Apex Global." The realization hit Victor with the physical force of a runaway freight train. His entire body jerked backward as if he had been physically struck by an invisible fist. The air seemed to vanish completely from his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, choking sound emerged from his throat. Preston stood completely frozen by his father's side, his arrogant posture dissolving into an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. The sophisticated illusion of their grand salvation shattered into a million jagged pieces. They suddenly understood that the miraculous financial lifeline they had been celebrating all evening was actually the rope I had custom woven for their execution. "Which brings me to the reality of your current situation," I said, pointing a steady, unyielding finger directly at the polished hardwood floor beneath his soaked Italian leather shoes. "I own this house, Victor. I own every single brick, every marble pillar, and every blade of grass on this entire estate. I own the titles to the leased luxury cars sitting in your circular driveway. I own the markers on your failing bankrupt investment firm. I legally purchased the $25 million debt you so recklessly racked up with your underground syndicate friends while desperately trying to fake your aristocratic lifestyle. I am your sole, undisputed creditor. You do not own an empire. You own absolutely nothing. You are completely, hopelessly bankrupt, and your entire existence is now legally bound to my signature. The silence that followed my declaration was so heavy and suffocating that it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The elite guests, the very people Victor and Preston had spent years trying to impress with their lavish parties and fake wealth, were listening to every single word with morbid fascination. The illusion of the Kensington legacy was being systematically dismantled, completely exposed as a fraudulent, desperate house of cards built on lies and stolen money. The whispers among the crowd grew louder, sharper, and filled with sudden, toxic judgment. The socialites who had been drinking Victor's expensive champagne just moments ago were now physically backing away from the Kensington family. They shrank back toward the walls, treating their former friends as if they carried a highly contagious plague. In the shallow, vicious world of high society, there is no sin greater than being exposed as a poor, heavily indebted fraud. Victor could not bear the staggering weight of the absolute public humiliation. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into a plush velvet dining chair, his hands flying up to clutch frantically at his chest. His breathing became shallow and ragged as the crushing reality of his total financial ruin crashed down upon his shoulders. He was a man who cared only about appearances, and I had just stripped him completely naked in front of his peers. His legacy was dead, his wealth was a pathetic mirage, and the man he had thrown freezing water on was now holding the absolute deed to his entire life. Preston, however, was not paralyzed by shame or public embarrassment. He was animated by a wild, frantic, and dangerous desperation. He saw his carefully constructed future evaporating before his very eyes. His fake wealth was gone. His offshore escape plan was destroyed, and the stoic federal agents standing firmly behind me meant his criminal exposure was absolute and unavoidable. His mask of the charming, devoted husband slipped completely, revealing the cowardly, panicking predator hiding underneath the expensive suit. He realized that his only remaining asset, his only possible leverage in this rapidly deteriorating nightmare, was the frightened woman standing beside him. He turned sharply toward Sarah. His handsome face was contorted into an ugly, vicious sneer of absolute desperation. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging brutally into her fragile skin. He yanked her toward him with a violent, possessive force that made her cry out in shock and pain. "He is lying," Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic as he tried to drag my terrified daughter toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. "He is making all of this up to ruin us because he is jealous. Do not listen to a single word he says. Come on, Sarah, we are leaving right now. We have to get out of here." Sarah struggled against his tightening grip, her eyes wide with fear and absolute confusion. She looked desperately from Preston to me, her mind frantically trying to process the horrifying scene unfolding around her. She was watching the man she loved transform into a violent stranger, while the father she had just accused of bitter jealousy stood as the only barrier between her and total destruction. "Let her go, Preston," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register that demanded instant obedience. "You stay out of this, you crazy old man," Preston yelled back, his grip tightening further on Sarah's arm. "She is my wife. We are leaving, and you cannot stop us." I did not raise my voice. I did not take a single step forward to engage him physically. I simply stood my ground, locked my eyes onto his panicked face, and snapped my fingers. Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker. He placed it firmly onto the grand dining table to end the debate. I slowly opened the heavy red folder on the mahogany table. The cracking sound vibrated through the stagnant air. The classical string quartet remained frozen. The wealthy socialites stood paralyzed, their champagne flutes held limply. They waited for me to speak, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. The pristine pages inside were covered in black ink and official government seals. I looked up and let my cold gaze sweep across the breathless room. The faces of the Boston elite stared back at me, a sea of arrogant socialites who judged every book by its faded cover. They had looked at my battered truck and my calloused hands and decided I was worthless. I turned my undivided attention back to Victor Kensington. His face had drained of all its vibrant color, leaving him a terrified shell of the patriarch who had humiliated me just 1 week ago. For the past year, you and your deceitful son have consistently treated me like an ignorant grease monkey. I began, my voice carrying an unyielding authority that effortlessly filled the vast ballroom. You foolishly assumed my grease-stained hands and my faded work truck meant I was nothing more than a pathetic mechanic. But you never bothered to look past your own blinding prejudice. If you had done a fraction of the due diligence required of a legitimate businessman, you would have quickly discovered the agonizing truth. I am the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole owner of Cole Logistics. We operate on 4 different continents, moving billions of dollars in commercial freight every single quarter. I am personally worth more than this entire room combined. A sharp gasp rippled through the massive crowd. The frantic whispers began almost immediately, a low murmur of absolute shock as the wealthy guests reevaluated the quiet man standing confidently before them. Victor simply stared at me, his jaw visibly trembling, his terrified eyes darting between my stoic face and the official documents resting heavily on the table. But that is only the first part of your catastrophic miscalculation. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. Your arrogance completely blinded you to the danger circling your fake empire. As of yesterday morning, I am also the sole architect, funder, and undisputed owner of a highly discreet private equity firm based in Geneva, a firm formerly known as Apex Global. The realization hit Victor with the physical force of a runaway freight train. His entire body jerked violently backward. The air seemed to vanish instantly from his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, wheezing sound emerged from his constricted throat. Preston stood completely frozen by his father's side, his arrogant posture fully dissolving into an expression of raw horror. The sophisticated, carefully constructed illusion of their financial salvation shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of their eyes. They suddenly understood that the miraculous financial lifeline they had been celebrating all evening was actually the hangman's rope I had custom woven for their immediate execution. Which brings me directly to the reality of your inescapable situation, I said, pointing a steady finger directly at the polished hardwood floor beneath his soaked Italian shoes. I own this house, Victor. I own every single brick in these walls, every marble pillar in this ballroom, and every blade of grass on this entire sprawling estate. I legally hold the clear titles to the luxury cars currently sitting in your circular driveway. I hold the absolute markers on your failing, bankrupt investment firm. Working in full cooperation with federal law enforcement, I legally purchased the $25 million debt you recklessly racked up with your underground syndicate friends while desperately trying to fake your aristocratic lifestyle. I am your sole, undisputed, and final creditor. You do not own a powerful empire. You own absolutely nothing. You are completely bankrupt, and your entire existence is now legally bound to my signature. The silence that followed was heavy. The elite guests, the people Victor and Preston had spent years trying to impress, were listening with morbid fascination. The grand illusion of the Kensington legacy was exposed as a desperate house of cards built on lies and borrowed money. The whispers among the crowd grew louder, filled with unforgiving judgment. The superficial socialites who had been drinking Victor's champagne just moments ago were now backing away. They shrank back toward the walls, treating their former friends as if they carried a lethal plague. In the shallow world of high society, there is no sin greater than being exposed as a poor, indebted fraud. Victor could not bear the staggering weight of the public humiliation. His legs gave out beneath his heavy frame. He collapsed backward into a plush velvet dining chair, his hands flying up to clutch frantically at his chest. His breathing became shallow and ragged, as the undeniable reality of his total financial ruin crashed down upon his shoulders. He was a hollow man who cared exclusively about public appearances, and I had just stripped him naked in front of his peers. His fake legacy was dead, and the quiet man he had thrown freezing water on was now holding the deed to his entire life. Preston, however, was not paralyzed by the shame. He was animated by a wild, dangerous desperation. He saw his carefully constructed future evaporating before his very eyes. His fake wealth was gone, his offshore escape plan was destroyed, and the federal agents standing firmly behind me meant his criminal exposure was absolute. His mask of the charming husband slipped completely, revealing the panicking predator hiding underneath the expensive suit. He realized that his only remaining asset, his only possible leverage in this rapidly deteriorating nightmare, was the frightened woman standing beside him. He turned sharply toward Sarah. His handsome face was violently contorted into an ugly, vicious sneer of absolute desperation. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging brutally into her fragile skin. He yanked her toward him with a possessive force that made her cry out in shock. "He is lying!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic as he tried to drag my terrified daughter toward the rear exit. "He is making all of this up to ruin us because he is jealous. Do not listen to a single word he says. Come on, Sarah. We are leaving right now. We have to get out of here." Sarah struggled frantically against his tightening grip, her eyes wide with fear and absolute confusion. She looked desperately from Preston to me, her mind frantically trying to process the horrifying scene unfolding around her. She was watching the man she loved transform into a violent stranger, while the father she had just accused of bitter jealousy stood as the only barrier between her and total destruction. "Let her go, Preston," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register that demanded instant obedience. "You stay out of this, you crazy old man," Preston yelled back, his grip tightening further on Sarah's arm. "She is my wife. We are leaving and you cannot stop us." I did not raise my voice. I did not take a single step forward to engage him physically. I simply stood my ground, locked my eyes onto his panicked face, and casually snapped my fingers. Jonathan immediately reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black Bluetooth speaker, setting it down onto the grand dining table. Jonathan immediately reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black Bluetooth speaker, setting it down onto the grand dining table. The small device sat squarely in the center of the pristine white silk tablecloth, resting right next to the thick red legal folder containing their absolute financial ruin. The ballroom was profoundly quiet. The soft electronic chime of the speaker connecting to my secure smartphone sounded incredibly loud. I did not break eye contact with Preston Kensington as I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit and withdrew my phone. I swiped a single finger across the glass screen and calmly pressed play. The high-definition audio flooded the ballroom, echoing against the marble pillars. The recording began with the acoustic signature of Victor's private study. The elite socialites leaned forward, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity and terror. They were about to witness the unvarnished reality of the family they desperately emulated. The first voice to boom out of the small speaker belonged to Victor Kensington, his tone dripping with profound aristocratic arrogance. The audio captured the exact moment they had returned from the wedding, still high on the thrill of their perceived victory. The ballroom heard Victor laughing as he proudly recounted throwing freezing water into my face. He described me as a pathetic animal. A collective shudder ran through the crowd. The laughter faded, replaced by Preston's calculating tone. His charming, fabricated public persona vanished entirely, revealing the calculating monster hiding beneath. The ballroom listened in horrified silence as Preston detailed his sinister, methodical plan to systematically destroy my daughter. His voice echoed through the speaker clinically, explaining how he intended to continue slipping high doses of anxiety medication into her evening tea. He openly bragged about his strategy to constantly gaslight her, to intentionally make her question her own sanity, and to isolate her completely from any outside support. The audio laid out his ultimate terrifying objective with chilling clarity. He planned to legally declare Sarah mentally unstable within 6 months, thereby activating the power of attorney clause he had secretly embedded in their marriage documents. He was going to seize total uncontested legal control over her $10 million trust fund, intending to use her inheritance to secretly pay off the massive invisible debts his family had recklessly accumulated. The elite guests who had previously idolized the Kensingtons now stared at Victor and Preston with open, unfiltered disgust. I watched Preston's face contort into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic, as his own voice betrayed him to the entire world. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to shout over the recording, but the audio seamlessly transitioned to a new, even more devastating conversation. The speaker crackled slightly before playing a recorded phone call Preston had made late at night from the dark confines of the estate gardens. It was the phone call to his hidden mistress, the woman he had kept a dark secret from everyone in his life. The ballroom listened as Preston's tone softened into a sickeningly sweet, affectionate croon. He promised his secret lover that his fake marriage to Sarah was strictly a temporary, necessary business transaction. He swore to her that the tedious nightmare of pretending to love a broken, fragile girl would be completely over very soon. The final devastating nail in his coffin came when he laid out his ultimate exit strategy. He promised the mistress that the very moment he successfully drained Sarah's trust fund, he would completely liquidate the stolen assets, abandon the sinking Kensington empire, and flee directly to Europe. He explicitly mentioned the secret child he had fathered with this hidden woman, promising that the three of them would live a life of absolute untouchable luxury, entirely funded by my daughter's engineered suffering and financial destruction. The sheer depth of the betrayal, the intricate sociopathic layers of his deception, hung heavily in the freezing air of the grand ballroom. The absolute truth was finally out, completely destroying any lingering shred of his fabricated, charming facade. Throughout the agonizing playback of the audio recording, Sarah had been struggling desperately against Preston's vicious, tightening grip on her arm. But as she listened to the cold, clinical description of how she was being systematically poisoned and manipulated, the frantic, panicked thrashing slowly stopped. The profound exhaustion and medicated haze that had clouded her beautiful face for the past week seemed to evaporate entirely. The overwhelming shock of the horrifying revelation did not break her spirit. Instead, it provided a sudden, blinding flash of absolute clarity. The heavy, suffocating veil of psychological manipulation shattered instantly, falling away to reveal the strong, intelligent woman I had raised. She stopped pulling away from him and simply stood perfectly still. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at Preston. Her eyes, previously filled with confusion and terror, were now burning with a bright, terrifying, and furious fire. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her entire future, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Preston stared back at her, his lips trembling, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that his absolute control over her had completely evaporated. Before he could utter a single pathetic, fabricated excuse, Sarah raised her free hand. She swung her arm with every ounce of strength she possessed, delivering a brutal, open-handed slap directly across Preston's handsome face. The exceptionally sharp, violent, and ringing sound of the impact echoed like a heavy rifle shot across the breathless, perfectly silent ballroom. The sheer force of the blow snapped Preston's head violently to the side, completely breaking his physical hold on her arm. He stumbled backward, his hand flying up to cover the rapidly reddening mark blossoming across his pale cheek, his eyes wide with stunned, pathetic disbelief. Sarah did not wait for him to recover. She turned her back on him, completely rejecting his entire existence, and walked purposefully across the polished marble floor. She moved with a newly discovered grace and strength, walking directly toward me. She stepped past the heavily armed federal agents and moved firmly into the protective shadow of my broad shoulders, taking her rightful place by my side. She wrapped her trembling arms tightly around my torso, burying her face into the fine wool of my expensive suit jacket, silently seeking the ultimate, unbreakable protection of her father. I placed a gentle, reassuring hand on her back, anchoring her to reality, letting her know that she was finally safe. Preston stood completely alone on the dais, rubbing his stinging face, sputtering a series of incoherent, pathetic lies to a room full of people who were looking at him like he was a dangerous monster. He looked desperately toward his father, but Victor was still slumped uselessly in his chair, completely broken by the reality of his total financial annihilation. The absolute silence of the ballroom was finally broken by the heavy, synchronized sound of tactical boots stepping forward on the polished hardwood floor. I looked over my daughter's head and gave a single subtle nod to the veteran law enforcement officers standing firmly behind me. The 4 federal agents stepped smoothly out of the shadows, their expressions cold, hardened, and entirely devoid of any sympathy. They reached seamlessly to the tactical belts resting securely on their waists, simultaneously producing 4 pairs of heavy, gleaming steel handcuffs, completely ready to execute the final devastating phase of my carefully calculated revenge. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping securely around Preston Kensington's wrists was the sharpest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard. He did not fight back. The sudden, overwhelming reality of federal law enforcement had completely drained the fight from his arrogant body. He stood there trembling violently as the lead agent firmly recited his Miranda rights, his voice echoing over the stunned silence of the ballroom. The charges were comprehensive and absolutely ruinous. Wire fraud, attempted embezzlement, federal forgery regarding the manipulation of a protected trust fund. Each word struck Preston like a physical blow, driving him further into a state of absolute pathetic submission. He looked desperately around the room, silently begging his wealthy peers for intervention, but not a single person stepped forward. The socialites simply stared in horrified fascination as the handsome prince of Boston high society was exposed as a common desperate criminal. The agents turned him around and marched him roughly down the steps of the marble dais, his expensive Italian shoes dragging uselessly against the floor. With his son being hauled away in disgrace, the final remnants of Victor Kensington's pride completely evaporated. The towering, intimidating patriarch collapsed from his plush velvet chair and fell heavily onto his knees. He crawled frantically across the polished hardwood floor, disregarding the puddle of freezing water that soaked his expensive trousers. He reached out with trembling, desperate hands, clutching blindly at the perfectly tailored fabric of my trousers. He was weeping openly, large, ugly tears streaming down his flushed face. He begged me for mercy. He pleaded with me to spare his public reputation, to leave him a fraction of his legacy, to not destroy the social standing he had spent a lifetime fraudulently building. He babbled incoherently about our shared history as fathers, desperately attempting to invoke a sense of empathy that he had never once shown me. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken, weeping man clutching my legs. I felt absolutely zero empathy. I felt no pity, no compassion, and no regret. I simply viewed him as a toxic obstacle that had finally been permanently removed from my daughter's life. I stepped back, forcing his grasping hands to fall empty against the cold floor. I looked down into his red, tear-stained eyes and delivered my final, unyielding judgment. The water at the wedding was cold, Victor, but a federal penitentiary is much colder. Get out of my house. The words hung in the air with chilling finality. 2 federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Victor by his arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. As the Kensingtons were dragged out of the grand ballroom, the wealthy guests finally broke their paralyzed silence. A frantic, panicked stampede toward the exits began. The social elite bumped into one another, abandoning their coats and leaving their expensive champagne glasses shattered on the floor, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Kensington Empire. Through the massive bay windows, I watched the flashing red and blue lights of the federal squad cars illuminating the manicured lawns. The Kensingtons were shoved into the back seats, their fraudulent reign officially terminated. As the chaotic noise of the fleeing crowd faded into the cool night air, I turned my full attention back to the most important person in the room. Sarah was standing near the edge of the dais, trembling uncontrollably. The sheer magnitude of the evening's revelations had completely overwhelmed her fragile, recovering mind. She looked at me, her beautiful eyes overflowing with hot, heavy tears. She took a hesitant step forward, and then she completely broke down. She practically collapsed into my open arms, burying her face into my chest, sobbing with a heartbreaking intensity. She wrapped her arms around my neck, holding on to me as if I were the only solid object in a rapidly spinning universe. She apologized repeatedly, her voice muffled by my suit jacket, begging for my forgiveness, for doubting me, for pushing me away, and for blindly believing the poisonous lies Preston had fed her. I held her tightly, resting my chin against the top of her head, gently stroking her hair. I told her that she never needed to apologize, that she was safe now, and that the nightmare was permanently over. The transition from that chaotic, traumatic night to our new reality was surprisingly swift. 1 month later, the toxic drama was officially dead and buried. The sprawling Kensington mansion, the grand estate that had served as the terrifying stage for their deception, no longer belonged to me. I had swiftly and quietly liquidated the massive property and donated every single cent of the proceeds to a local charity dedicated to supporting victims of financial abuse. It was a fitting, poetic end to a monument built entirely on fraudulent arrogance. Preston and Victor were currently sitting in a cold, heavily guarded federal detention center. Due to the overwhelming, indisputable evidence we had provided, including the wiretaps and the offshore banking records, a federal judge had categorically denied them bail. They were facing decades behind bars, their fake aristocratic legacy permanently reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and absolute ruin. I was no longer wearing a $10,000 Tom Ford suit. I was standing comfortably in my home garage wearing my faded flannel shirt and heavily worn mechanic overalls. The scent of motor oil and quiet peace filled the air. I was exactly where I belonged. Standing right next to me, leaning over the open hood of a classic muscle car, was my beautiful daughter. Sarah looked incredibly healthy. The color had fully returned to her cheeks, the dark shadows under her eyes were completely gone, and the heavy medicated fog had been entirely lifted from her brilliant mind. Her hands were covered in dark grease as she adjusted a wrench. I was patiently teaching her how to rebuild a carburetor from scratch. We had lost the toxic attachments that had nearly destroyed our family, and in the process, we gained each other back. We were stronger and unbroken. I looked at her, reflecting on the chaos of the past few months. I had not just saved my money from a family of sociopathic parasites. I had saved my daughter's life by refusing to act like a victim. Sarah tightened the final bolt, stepped back, and gave me a brilliant smile. I reached out and turned the ignition key. The story of our survival faded out on the deep, triumphant, and rhythmic sound of a powerful engine roaring beautifully back to life. Family is not defined by blood alone, and unconditional love should never be an excuse to tolerate abuse. I spent my life building an empire to protect my daughter, only to realize that true protection means teaching her how to see through deception. When people show you their true colors, do not close your eyes. Believe them the very first time. Setting boundaries and enforcing harsh consequences is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of love and self-respect. You can give someone the entire world, but you must never let them take your dignity in return. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel today. Have you ever faced a shocking family betrayal? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your strength inspires me to keep going every day. I read every single one. Thank you all, friends.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.